Let's start, I guess. Let's start with this one. A neuron. I don't know how everybody's going to see. Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basic parts. You got the cell body right here. Cell body has the nucleus. The big plastic branches coming off like that, and this guy over here are dendrites. Okay. Right about here would be that axon, or here. I mean, I don't know where it's labeled in the keys, but this would be where the cell body tapers, the axon hillock. Somewhere in this area is going to be the initial segment of the axon where that action potential would initiate. Then the action potential will jump to the next little opening. This is a space here is a node of Ranvier between Schwann cells. We'll get back to the Schwann cells in just a second. Schwann cells make the myelin sheath. Over here, let me grab this guy. Here, they're showing other neurons synapsing with this either dendrites or, like in cases like this guy over here, this guy synapses directly on the cell body. So it's showing you all the communication that goes on between just one neuron and many other neurons. And really, this is this. An axon terminal and a synaptic end bulb. Axon terminal, synaptic end bulb. The relationship between this cell and this cell is a synapse. Just like the relationship between this cell and this cell is a synapse. Okay. Here you have a Schwann cell that makes myelin in the peripheral nervous system. And literally the fatty material, as you're really young, as you're maturing, starts to wrap around like layers of an onion around the axon. Okay, so here, these like distinct layers are just referred to as the myelin sheath of a Schwann cell. It's an insulator of the electricity. As it's developing, the myelin pushes the cytoplasm to the periphery of the Schwann cell. It's a different setup in the central nervous system. Here's the cytoplasm and the nucleus of a Schwann cell, and because they're pushed to the periphery, they have a special name called the neurolemma. So out here is the neurolemma of a Schwann cell. It's actually clinically significant. It helps damaged nerves grow back better in the peripheral nervous system if the neurolemma is not damaged. So peripheral nerves have a much better outcome of injury recovery than central nervous system neurons. But anyway, neurolemma. Okay, myelin sheath. Myelin, you see that myelin sheath? The whole cell is a Schwann cell. The gap between Schwann cells, node of Ranvier. Here you have the axon. They're cutting the axon open. You can distinctly see the cell membrane or plasma membrane of the axon, which of course they don't call a cell membrane, they call an axolemma. So axolemma is just a fancy word for the cell membrane of an axon, and the cytoplasm of an axon is called axoplasm. So you just have to remember those terms. Over here again, not too much else to add. Axon terminal, synaptic end bulb. In the synaptic end bulb, you've got synaptic vesicles, membrane-bound vesicles holding. Here they open up a couple of them. You can see the neurotransmitters. Here you see neurotransmitters being released into the space between this cell and that cell. It says, what's that space? Synaptic cleft. Okay. What's the relationship between this cell and that cell? A synapse. If it's the ones in the middle cabinet, up a little ways, where you see the axon terminals and synaptic end bulbs synapsing with skeletal muscle, it's a neuromuscular junction, which is a type of synapse. Okay, so it's still a synapse, but it's called a neuromuscular junction. So it's that guy. Put that there somewhere. Let's look at. Find a space for that guy. Look at these two models are almost essentially the same. This one's a little bit more detailed. Somebody asked me earlier, how do you tell dorsal from ventral? For me, the easiest way, especially when it's really obvious, is dorsal root ganglion, that very distinct bulge that you see this is the dorsal root, dorsal root ganglion. These are the dorsal rootlets, which I don't even know if it's on the word bank. I'm not too worried about rootlets versus root. But you see just smaller bundles of axons. This is a bigger bundle of axons. So the dorsal root ganglion, that's where the cell bodies of afferent neurons are going to be located, which they kind of tell you right there. Okay? So the sensory pathways are coming from somewhere in the body up this way, and they're going to go that way. Cell body right there, neuron continues, and these neurons enter into the dorsal gray horn, where they may synapse immediately or may not. Same thing, dorsal root ganglion, dorsal root. Okay, here's the ventral rootlets. Ventral root, it's only carrying efferent or motor information. Where they connect or join is the spinal nerve. Technically, a spinal nerve only goes from about here to here, and this very first branch is that dorsal rami of a spinal nerve. It's going to supply structures that are dorsal to the spinal column. And then the much bigger, almost looks like just a continuation of the spinal nerve, is the ventral rami of a spinal nerve. Here they don't make that distinction. So if it's right there, it's a spinal nerve. If it's right there, it's a spinal nerve. But if it's distinctly on this guy, dorsal rami of spinal nerve, ventral rami of spinal nerve. These two guys are dealing with the autonomic nervous system. Gray and white rami communicans, we're not going to go there. So we're going to ignore these, which this model does. Okay, dorsal gray horn, lateral gray horn, ventral gray horn. Dorsal gray horn, lateral gray horn, ventral gray horn. We already mentioned the dorsal horn is the entry point for sensory neurons. The lateral gray horn is going to be where you're going to find the cell bodies of autonomic, here they refer to it as visceral, same thing, motor neurons. So autonomic motor neurons have cell bodies right there. And the ventral, they put it up here, I'd have put it over here in the black, right there is going to be where the ventral gray horn, where the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons will be located. In other words, these are going to be neurons that go out and supply skeletal muscles. So bottom line is you only have motor neurons in here, you've only got sensory neurons in here. When you're here, you have both motor and sensory neurons. Okay. Up in here, we'll call this dorsal white column, lateral white column, ventral white column. So just a bunch of myelinated axons. You can see it maybe either one of these. Right here would be the white, the anterior white commissure. Right here would be the gray commissure, where the gray matter kind of connects between the two sides. Don't get the gray commissure, or over here, confused with the central canal, which is that obvious little opening. Even here, you can see it right there. You can see this guy's grooved on this side, depicting where the central canal would be. So the central canal is basically right in the center of the gray commissure. I think that's everything. Oh, ventral, this one's more obvious. Ventral median fissure, dorsal median sulcus. Okay. Fissure is a big groove, a sulcus is a shallow groove. All right, this is the simplest of all the models, just showing arrangement of spinal cord and spinal nerves relative to vertebra. Spinal cord, the opening made by all the adjacent vertebrae is referred to as the vertebral foramen. Foramen just means hole. And the spinal nerves exit from in between holes made from adjacent vertebrae and the intervertebral disc here, called intervertebral foramen, or IVFs. So this is an IVF, or intervertebral foramen. It says what space is that? Intervertebral foramen. It says what space is that? Vertebral foramen. It says what's that? Spinal nerve. Intervertebral disc, vertebral body, which you already know from A&P-2 Lab. A lot of stuff on this one. The good news is there are only 3 of these models, and if anybody else is doing a practical on the nervous system too, there would be less than them, so I don't know how many will be available for me to set up. But we'll start at the top, cerebrum. Showing the cerebrum. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that pop off your brain. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves, there's 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And the cranial nerves are numbered in Roman numerals. In the lecture, you're going to have to memorize cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve, etc. On the models, they're numbered, so that's half the battle. And I think there's only 3, maybe 4 cranial nerves in the word bank. The first couple cranial nerves, the first 3 actually, come off the cerebrum. That's how they're numbered. The highest cranial nerves would be cranial nerve 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. The 12th cranial nerve, which is the hypoglossal nerve, or in other words, the motor nerve to your tongue, comes off the brainstem, in particular the medulla oblongata. It's labeled right there, Roman numeral 12. Okay? But anyway, back to the cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, the nerve of smell. Cranial nerve 2, right there, is the optic nerve, which you can also see on this guy really clearly. The optic nerve comes right off your retina. It's the nerve of visual acuity. There's the optic nerve going right through the eyeball, little optic foramen in the sphenoid bone there. And then over here you can see the optic nerve as well. Where the optic nerves connect and then crisscross with the optic tracts is called the optic chiasma that we talked about before, that we'll talk about again on the brain. Okay? But anyway, right there or right there, cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve, which they label right there. And you can see the 2 optic nerves connecting at the optic chiasma, and then the information would continue on as the optic tract. Some of the information stays on the same side, some crosses over. It's kind of complicated. So cerebrum, you can see the 2 cranial nerves right there that we just mentioned. Now, you can't see the diencephalon on this because it's totally enveloped by the cerebrum, but you can see the midbrain, although I'll never ask it on this model, the pons of the brainstem, which you can't miss because it's huge ventral bulging right there, and then right below the pons, the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. And again, the medulla oblongata, the way to remember it on this model is the hypoglossal nerve is coming off at cranial nerve 12. So right below the medulla oblongata, this is all what? Starting from here down.
Spinal cord?
Spinal cord, yep. And you can see the ventral median fissure that you can see on these models. Okay. Big networks of nerves, interbranching nerves on either side of the spinal column are called plexi. This is the cervical plexus. Not much to it relative to the big brachial plexus, but that's the cervical plexus. It's made from branches coming off the ventral rami of spinal nerves C1 through 5. We'll talk about in the lecture. This is the more well-known brachial plexus because it's involved in so many brachial plexus syndromes. It has to squeeze through the scalene muscles and all the, the rib and all that, first rib, and anyway, entire nerve supply to the shoulder and arm. All the big radial nerve, ulnar nerve, median nerve, and carpal tunnel all come off the brachial plexus. Down here, you've got the lumbar plexus. Okay, all this stuff is the lumbar plexus. The biggest nerve coming off the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve. It's going to supply the anterior thigh musculature and other structures in the front of your leg. You can see the femoral nerve right there. Other than that, it's lumbar plexus. You can also see the femoral nerve. You can see it from here, if they weren't in the way, on the muscle guy there, on his left groin, right beneath the inguinal ligament there. You see that big yellow structure? That's the femoral nerve. The only place it's superficial is right by the inguinal ligament. Otherwise, it tucks deep into the thigh musculature. So I've definitely asked femoral nerve on that model in the past. Lumbar plexus, femoral nerve. This big stuff down here, this is the sacral plexus. And although you can't see it, the biggest nerve that comes off the sacral plexus is the sciatic nerve, which probably everybody's heard of. So you can't see the sciatic nerve on here, but these big branches are going to make up the sciatic nerve, which if you go back to the muscle guy, you can't see it here, but if you flip them around and peeled off his gluteus maximus, you're going to see a big giant yellow nerve. That's the sciatic nerve. You can't really miss it. It's about yay thick. Biggest nerve in the body. Okay. Back up here. On either, a lot of stuff they're only showing on one side, just so you not so much clutter. All these are ganglia, and they'd be over here too. In this case, they're related to the sympathetic division of the nervous system. There's going to be parasympathetic ganglia down here, but we're not going to worry about them. And all these, collectively, all these sympathetic ganglia are connected by branches, and it's known as the sympathetic trunk. Okay? The highest ganglia is a pretty famous one, or infamous. It's the superior cervical ganglia. Every cell body of every neuron that supplies blood vessels in your brain starts right there, and it sits right on either this side of your neck, right outside the vertebra, and tight neck muscles and inflammation and stuff like that can affect this, which then affects vasculature and big-time headaches. So one of the major, obviously a lot of causes of headaches, but irritation to this can affect blood flow in the brain is the moral of the story. So know the superior cervical ganglion and the sympathetic trunk. If it was pointed right here and it said what layer of the meninges is this, it would be pia, because it's physically adhered, just like same anything on brain. If it's like what layer of the meninge would be right there, the pia, which you can really see on the sheep brain, is tightly adhered to the actual central nervous system tissue. You can't see the arachnoid really anywhere. I might be on the word bank, but I'm not going to ask it because I can't find it. The dura mater, they only show really on this side, and it's pretty thick. You can kind of follow it all the way down. It gets real obvious down here. You can see where it terminates right there, and they refer to it's not on the word bank, but they actually refer to this as the cul-de-sac, kind of where the dura ends, right around the sacrum area. So you can definitely see the dura, and again, I usually ask the pia on the sheet because it's just so convenient to do so. There are extensions of the pia. They only show on this side, thickenings and lateral extensions of the pia. There's maybe, I forget exactly, I think there's 18 pairs, there might be 21, called denticulate ligaments. Denticulate means like tooth-like. And you can see it, like right here is where they label them, or right there and there. But they're kind of bluish, and they come off the lateral part of the pia from the spinal cord here. And they run out, and they'll merge with the arachnoid, and then merge with the dura, and then anchor to the bone of the vertebra to help prevent, lateral transplacement, keep the spinal cord in place. So these are all denticulate ligaments right there, there. Down here, spinal cord ends at about the L1-2 level, just right above your belly button. It's called the conus medullaris because it's kind of a cone-shaped termination. And then there's extension of the pia, which they label right there in the midline of this mess here, called the filum terminale. And you can see people have written on this, probably me. Runs down the very midline. I always ask it right where it's labeled to make it as easy as possible. And it'll run down the midline here and merge with the arachnoid, merge with the dura, then continue on and eventually anchor to the coccyx down here. So the filum terminale of the pia mater and the denticulate ligaments just help to hold everything in place. Everything else on the sides of that filum terminale, if it's pointed right there, or right here, or right there, it's going to be that cauda equina. It's the collection of nerves that are still within that thecal sac, which is sometimes another name like for the sac that the dura makes. So within the dura, way down here, way below the termination of the spinal cord, you got this collection of nerves that somebody thought looked like a horse's tail, so they called it cauda equina. And there's cauda equina syndrome and stuff like that. Irritation of these nerves. I once dealt with a lady who hadn't gone to the bathroom in over a week. She had irritation because of a bulging disc that was banging into this collection of nerves. I proudly say she went home and took a crap. Okay. That might be it on this model, but there is quite a bit of stuff on here.
All right, let's do the brain.
Okay. Where's the other? Oh, there it is. Put it together first. Somebody was having a seizure. I haven't had anybody have a seizure in class in well over 10 years.
So you did.
Two different people, way back. Had nothing to do with me though. All right, got the big cerebrum. That's the starting point. The two cerebellar hemispheres separated by the longitudinal fissure. So fissure is a big groove, and this is the longitudinal fissure. Separates your brain into a right and left side or cerebral hemisphere. Structures on the right and left side are not anatomically identical. You have some stuff on the left side, usually it's not on the right side. Okay. So that's the longitudinal fissure. And then over here, the big fissure between the cerebellum and the cerebrum is the transverse fissure. So two big fissures. You also have two cerebellar hemispheres. Then for the lobes of the cerebrum, which I could ask here or on the sheep brain, the biggest lobe is the frontal lobe, which actually we'll talk about specifically is going to run from this particular sulcus right here. Everything to the front is the frontal lobe. Then from here to right about there is going to be the parietal lobe. And then back here is the occipital lobe right above the cerebellum, right where your occipital bone would be. And then right here is going to be the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, where your ear would be. Okay. This is actually called the lateral cerebral sulcus. I don't know if that's on the word bank or not. That's what it's called. Other than maybe the lateral cerebral sulcus, if it is on the word bank, just between the temporal and frontal lobes here, you do need to know the central sulcus. I ask it every time, so make sure you focus on this. It's a real big sulcus, and you can see it right there on this side. This side, it looks like it's right there, so they're making the two sides are not perfectly symmetrical, but that's the reality. That's the way the brain is. So you got a central sulcus here. You see how it's much more, this one ends there. This is the only one that starts right in the midline and keeps going all the way down for quite a ways. Central sulcus. In front of it is the frontal lobe. Behind it, posterior, is the parietal lobe. Same thing, central sulcus over here. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe. These are in between sulci in the brain. You've got a gyrus, or gyri for plural, and it gives the brain that convoluted look. Among other things, a surface area issue. But some of these gyri have names. And in the lecture and the lab, we're going to talk about the pre-central gyrus of the frontal lobe, the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe, because they're clinically extremely significant. And I'll just briefly mention it now. All the cell bodies involved in skeletal motor pathways initiate right there in the precentral gyrus. And all sensory information from almost all of, not all, but almost all of your entire body, except some of the special senses, all the sensory information is interpreted in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. So if you step on a nail and it hurts and you can tell it's on the bottom of your foot, that means that information made it up right there. Okay? So post-central gyrus, central sulcus, pre-central gyrus. Pre-central gyrus is part of the frontal lobe, post-central gyrus part of the parietal lobe. Crack this guy open. Same thing, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe you can't see from this vantage point. Kind of technically part of the cerebrum, but the biggest of the white matter tracts that connect the right and left side of your brain, and the most famous one is the corpus callosum. So this is just a big area of myelinated neurons that connect the two cerebral hemispheres, so information can be integrated between the right and left side of your brain. Corpus callosum, structurally larger in females than males. Talk about why that might be in the lecture. But that's, and you can see it on the sheep brain too. So one of the, either going to get it, you're definitely going to get it. It's either going to be here or on the sheep brain. Right underneath the corpus callosum One is where you're going to see the first two ventricles, which are the lateral ventricles, and also right basically where you're going to see the diencephalon, which is all this. Okay. So here's your diencephalon, circling the diencephalon, which normally you can't see because it's covered by the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. The top of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. Epi means on top of. Pineal gland hangs off the epithalamus. So follow that up, right there, epithalamus. The thalamus is in the middle of the diencephalon, and on this, I would always ask it right where this little circle is. I'll explain that in a second, but this is going to be the thalamus, and then below it is the hypothalamus. And one way to follow the infundibulum up, and then you know you're at the hypothalamus. Don't get this confused with the hypothalamus. This is actually the optic chiasma again. This little guy here where those two optic nerves merge and then info may or may not get crossed over to the other side of the body. So that's the optic chiasma. Then everything behind the optic chiasma down here is the hypothalamus. Infundibulum, pituitary. So one more time, hypothalamus, thalamus, epithalamus, with the pineal gland hanging off it. This little guy right here, in real life, fits right through that little hole right there in the third ventricle. And the thalamus is actually made up of two halves with a little intermediate mass that pokes through that hole and holds them together. So where my two fingers are would be where the thalamus would be, and in between it is the third ventricle of the brain, one of the ventricles that makes CSF. So we'll get back to that again in just a second. So all this diencephalon, and right below the diencephalon, from here to right there, you've got the brainstem. And the three parts of the brainstem, the highest, most superior part is the midbrain, which is going to be right inferior to the hypothalamus, so that and that. So this area right here is the midbrain. This big bulge right there in the front is the pons again of the brainstem. And then from here to here is the medulla oblongata. And two ways that I look at it where you can tell where the medulla starts and the spinal cord ends. This little groove right there is the central canal of the spinal cord. Right here, in front of the cerebellum and behind the brainstem is where this fourth ventricle would be, that's the fourth ventricle right there. And from the fourth ventricle, CSF either trickles into the central canal or the subarachnoid space, which is immediately outside of the central nervous system tissue. Another way I would look at it, other than the beginning of the central canal here, associated with the spinal cord, right here is about where the foramen magnum would be. And when you start getting level with the cerebrum, you're looking at the brainstem. Okay? So medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain of the brainstem. That's it for that. Last thing, just the ventricles of the brain, which again would be sitting right like that. I mean, they're literally, the ventricles start literally immediately underneath the corpus callosum that we mentioned. So right here would be where the lateral ventricles would be. So these two big ones here, that kind of strange shape, are the lateral ventricles. And the red that's associated here, this is the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle. The choroid plexus is what makes the CSF from blood plasma. So lateral ventricle, choroid plexus, the lateral ventricle. Okay. Then from there, the CSF that's made here is going to trickle down into these two little, they're called intervertebral foramen. It's not in the word bank, but basically CSF is going to, made in the lateral ventricles, is going to trickle into the third ventricle, which again is, all this is the third ventricle right there, between my fingers. And the red that's on top of the third ventricle there is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is going to make CSF also, and accumulate CSF that's trickled down from the fourth ventricle. All these the linings of the ventricles are ciliated, so the CSF made in here is pushed eventually into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it's going to go down, be pushed down this tube here, which is the cerebral aqueduct, and enter the fourth ventricle. Cerebral aqueduct is on the word bank, and I always ask it on this model because it's really obvious right there. And then fourth ventricle right here, choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, and then from there, CSF is either going to travel down into the central canal or that subarachnoid space that we had mentioned. Last thing, this shows a couple cranial nerves, and what it really shows is the big blood supply to the brain. Cranial nerve 1, you might see in a key these referred to as olfactory bulbs. We're not going to worry about the distinction. We'll just call this cranial nerve 1, olfactory nerve. Remember the cribiform plate of the ethmoid bone, the little holes and everything? Little branches of this nerve sit in the top of your nose and nasal cavity and pick up chemicals for smell. Right here, you've got cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, poking through the optic foramen of the sphenoid bone. So you can see the optic nerves right there, right in the middle, where they cross and connect, I should say, or going to be that optic chiasma. I would never ask it right there. You can also see the optic nerve right there in the back of the eye socket as it's coming from the retina. So the nerve of visual acuity, or 20/20 vision nerve. Then the other cranial nerve, and if I ask the trigeminal nerve or cranial nerve 5, I always ask it on this model because it's perfect. Tri means 3. It's the biggest cranial nerve. It's got 3 huge branches. It's the major sensory nerve to your face. Also supplies all the chewing muscles. You can see the 3 big branches coming off it right there and there. So that's your trigeminal or cranial nerve 5 right there. 2 big major pairs of blood vessels that supply the brain with blood. You have the posterior third of the brain supplied ultimately by branches from the 2 vertebral arteries. And I don't know if you went into it when you did the bony stuff or whatever, but the vertebral arteries are called vertebral arteries because they go through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebra. So the cervical vertebrae have these little special bony holes in them to transmit this artery, and there's a vein, a vertebral vein, and there's some nerves in there. But there's the vertebral artery, and there's the vertebral artery. It's going to ultimately supply, by way of named branches, the posterior third of the brain's blood supply. So not a good blood vessel to have plaquing or damage to because that's stroke material. And you can see at the foramen magnum, the 2 vertebral arteries coming up, and they merge to form a basilar artery, which is right at the base of the occiput, hence its name. And the basilar artery, which is right there, is going to give rise to, again, branches that supply the posterior third of the brain, and also this circle of Willis. This is the circle of Willis, this little circular interconnecting network of blood vessels. Alternate routes of blood to the same places of the brain help prevent strokes. So if one area gets clogged, there's alternative routes of blood. So it's a pretty famous little network of blood vessels interconnecting, and they call it the circle of Willis. So you can see the 2 vertebral arteries merge to a basilar artery, and that helps to give rise to this circle of Willis. Over this way, here's your common carotid artery, which I know you went over that. It gives rise, it bifurcates into an external carotid, which stays superficial, and the deeper internal carotid, which is right there. The internal carotid stays deep, goes through the carotid foramen, which you can see, and pops up there, and it's going to give rise to branches that supply the front 2/3 of your brain with blood. You definitely don't want to have clogging of your internal carotid artery or, again, stroke. And it also helps to give rise to that circle of Willis there. Okie dokie. That's about everything. Maybe. Probably forgot a few things. I'll remember the practical for then.